The most profound miscalculation of her illustrious 38-year tenure in public service occurred on an otherwise ordinary Tuesday morning in March, and this monumental error was not rooted in a misguided statement. She delivered. Nor was it a failure to anticipate a difficult inquiry, nor even an oversight regarding a crucial document. Rather, her definitive oversight was simply striding into the hallowed Senate chamber with the unwavering conviction that another triumph was inevitable. She had successfully navigated every formidable challenge the nation's capital had ever directed her way, weathering the darkest of threats, the deeply unsettling imagery of hostility, and the harrowing reality of an intruder who had breached the sanctity of her home and brought physical harm to her beloved spouse. She had endured the complexities of leading through 2 historic impeachments. While navigating the turbulent waters of 2 others, she did not initiate standing resilient against colleagues who sought to pivot leadership away from her, alongside allies whose faith had momentarily wavered, and confronting opponents who had dedicated entire careers to seamlessly associating her legacy with everything they found distasteful about the established political echelon. She had gracefully survived that crisp December morning in the year 2021, when she approached the press conference podium and conveyed to the nation her perspective that members of the legislative branch should retain the liberty to engage in the trading of equities, articulating the belief that within a vibrant free market economy, elected officials should inherently possess the right to participate in that financial ecosystem, only to observe the subsequent media clip proliferate rapidly across digital platforms before she had even exited the premises. Furthermore, she had successfully weathered the subsequent February morning a mere 6 weeks later, when she gracefully reversed her stance under mounting public discourse, announcing her newly formed support for a comprehensive trading prohibition, while offering minimal elaboration for the philosophical shift save for the tacit acknowledgement that the public sentiment had swelled to a magnitude necessitating a definitive response. She had even endured the intense evening following the State of the Union address, where seated across from an astute journalist in a brightly illuminated television studio, she was asked to articulate a response to the chief executive, directly invoking her name before a joint session of the legislature. When pressed to address the swirling discourse surrounding the equity trading controversies, her family's private financial portfolio, and the cumulative weight of nearly 4 decades of public inquiries regarding the vast chasm between her official government compensation and her overall net worth, she had produced, after all of that historical scrutiny, a famously concise 4-word directive. Look at your own self. She had triumphed over all of these trials, seamlessly transforming every critique into a catalyst for mobilization. As the consequent fundraising appeals seemingly composed themselves, turning every moment of intense public scrutiny into a remarkable surge of supportive donations. This phenomenon represented the foundational truth of her extraordinary political longevity, as she had mastered over 38 years the essential understanding that the most effective strategy for surviving the Mason's relentless environment of the capital was to ensure that any critique levied against her exacted a heavy political and financial toll upon those who dared to initiate it. Thus, she walked into the grand Senate chamber on that fateful Tuesday morning, harboring the bone-deep, unwavering confidence characteristic of an individual who had never once miscalculated the trajectory of her own professional survival, entirely convinced that she was on the precipice of replicating her customary success. What she remained blissfully unaware of, however, was that the presiding senator had been meticulously preparing for this exact encounter for 6 long weeks. She was unaware of the thoughtfully curated folders resting on the dais, and she was fundamentally unequipped for the precise nature of the inquiry that awaited her. The grand chamber steadily filled in the distinctive manner it always assumed prior to a moment of historical significance, devoid of any chaotic energy, but instead permeated by a very particular heavy quality of focused attention, the exact atmospheric tension that effortlessly collects within spaces where every individual is acutely aware that the broadcast cameras are actively recording, and that the annals of history might be keenly observing every available seat within the press gallery, was entirely occupied by 9:30 in the morning. While her allied colleagues arrived with deliberate punctuality, arranging themselves in a display of unified support, the legislative hearing had been rigorously prepared for, formally designated in the official congressional record as the Senate Judiciary Committee. Hearing on the legislation aimed at preventing elected leaders from holding specific financial securities, featuring sworn testimony and comprehensive review. The proposed legislation was named directly, deliberately, and perhaps somewhat provocatively, after the very stateswoman who was currently making her highly anticipated entrance through the majestic main doors of the chamber at exactly 47 minutes past the hour of 9. As she crossed the threshold, the atmospheric dynamics of the room noticeably shifted, mirroring the subtle yet undeniable transformation that occurs whenever an individual who has effortlessly commanded such spaces for decades makes their presence known. She carried herself with the poise of her 85 years, walking with a steady, measured pace that projected an undeniable ownership of the floor. A space she had, for the better part of 2 decades, essentially controlled her. Chin remained perfectly level, and her dedicated staff flanked her with the practiced, seamless formation. Typical of professionals who had executed this exact choreography countless times before, she thoughtfully acknowledged her legislative colleagues with remarkably small, precise nods, subtle gestures meticulously calculated to convey profound solidarity without projecting even a fraction of uncertainty. Notably, she did not direct her gaze toward the presiding senator who had been seated in problem elements, the chairman's position. For a full 11 minutes prior to her arrival, he maintained a remarkably uncluttered workspace, possessing only a classic yellow legal pad, 2 writing instruments, one securely grasped in his hand, the other aligned perfectly parallel to the right-hand edge of the excess. Pad and 4 manila folders arranged in a flawless, precise stack to his immediate right, their edges perfectly squared. He was intently reviewing a document on his pad when the esteemed stateswoman entered, and he distinctly chose not to look up immediately. A deliberate action that could be interpreted either as a subtle display of incivility or as the deeply studied focus of an individual who had arrived early, purely by his own volition, rather than by the dictates of procedural protocol. He finally raised his eyes when she reached the designated witness table, offering a singular nod that was neither overtly warm nor distinctly cold, but rather steeped in procedural neutrality. The committee chairman officially called the session to order, navigating the routine, parliamentary language, the obligatory recording instructions, and the formal declarations regarding the foundational purpose of the gathering, the specific brand of bureaucratic pageantry that universally precedes any event of true consequence within the nation's capital. Upon the completion of the formalities, the stateswoman gracefully requested the customary permission to deliver her opening remarks. Before the formal questioning commenced, the chairman respectfully directed his gaze toward the presiding senator, who methodically set down his pen and offered a simple, welcoming affirmative. She stood up, embodying a presence that 38 years of public service had refined into something that can neither be artificially taught nor convincingly feigned. The profound ability to effortlessly fill a vast room with the sheer weight of her own internal certainty. Whenever she utilized her voice in grand spaces such as this, the entire room seemed to naturally organize itself around her cadence, a phenomenon that had remained consistent throughout her career. Political opponents had dedicated decades attempting to fracture this unique magnetic ability, yet none had successfully managed to dismantle it. 38 years, she articulated, delivering the phrase with the undeniable gravitas of an individual stating a deeply earned truth, rather than engaging in an empty boast, firmly establishing the parameters of the conversation. That is precisely how long I have had the distinct honor of serving the wonderful people of my home district and the citizens of this great nation. 38 years dedicated to fiercely advocating for the betterment of working families during moments when the broader political establishment preferred to avert its gaze. I fought relentlessly for comprehensive health care access when the massive insurance conglomerates deployed every available resource in this city to actively oppose our progress. I championed the protection of our environment when the fossil fuel industry possessed the political capital to potentially halt our capital. Momentum, I stood steadfast in defense of the vital institutions that uphold this democracy. When those very pillars were facing unprecedented pressure from factions that would have eagerly dismantled them, had I and the dedicated public, servants in this room, not firmly planted ourselves in their path. She thoughtfully surveyed the room, her demeanor noticeably shifting away from mere performance into a realm of earnest communication. I was instrumental in shepherding the landmark healthcare legislation into reality. Every seasoned political analyst declared it an insurmountable task, and a strategic advisor within my own coalition cautioned me that the necessary support was simply non-existent. Nevertheless, I successfully secured the required coalition. Today, tens of millions of our fellow citizens have access to vital medical care simply because during that pivotal year, an individual occupied the Speaker's chair who fundamentally refused to accept the premise of impossibility. Furthermore, I successfully navigated the complex legislative process to pass the critical Manufacturing Act, a monumental achievement that actively repatriated semiconductor production back to our domestic soil. During a highly precarious moment, when the vulnerabilities within our global supply chain had escalated into a genuine crisis of national security. Additionally, I steadfastly guided this revered institution through two historically unprecedented impeachment proceedings when the weight of the evidence absolutely demanded action, despite the very real and significant political capital such endeavors required. This extensive history is my true record. It does not consist of 38 years merely occupying a seat in the Capitol, passively accumulating whatever superficial benefits. This environment tends to offer those who simply manage to remain long enough. It is fundamentally 38 years, defined by engaging in necessary battles for deeply complex issues, constantly pushing back against powerful entities that possessed every conceivable motivation to obstruct my efforts. She allowed those powerful words to gently settle over the assembled audience, a rhetorical technique at which she was exceptionally skilled. And now, I find myself invited into this distinguished chamber to formally address a piece of legislation that prominently features my own name, a very name I have proudly carried throughout this entire journey, which is now seemingly being utilized as a convenient shorthand to imply ethical compromise. Her vocal tone did not elevate in volume. Throughout her storied career, it had rarely needed to allow me to address the underlying implications present in this space with absolute clarity, ensuring that no ambiguity whatsoever remains in the historical record. I, in my official capacity, do not personally hold or trade individual, corporate equities. Furthermore, I possess absolutely no prior knowledge of, nor do I have any subsequent involvement whatsoever in the independent financial transactions executed by my spouse. Is a private citizen in every sense of the term. He does not participate in these legislative committee hearings. He is not a recipient of classified intelligence briefings, and he holds no authority to cast a vote on any pending legislation. He is my devoted partner of 6 decades, not a professional extension of my public office. It is crucial to understand that my husband had already established himself as a highly successful professional in the business sector, long before I ever made the decision to enter public life. Prior to my initial swearing in as a member of this legislative body, in the late 1980s, he had already spent years meticulously cultivating his financial portfolio. He has simply continued the practice of independently managing his personal investments as a private citizen, adhering to a standard of absolute legal compliance and providing full transparent disclosure precisely as dictated by all applicable ethical regulations. If there truly exists any credible evidence, if there has at any point in history ever been a shred of evidence indicating any form of impropriety, the Department of Justice was established for that exact investigative purpose. That institution has existed concurrently throughout the entirety of my public service, maintaining unhindered access to every single financial disclosure document I have ever been required to submit. I am currently unaware of any active investigations being conducted, and I am similarly unaware of any official findings of wrongdoing for the simple and undeniable reason that no such wrongdoing exists. She paused briefly, preparing to deliver her final thought. I wish to articulate one additional point, and I intend to state it with absolute directness. She pivoted slightly, not aiming her gaze solely at the presiding senator, but rather encompassing the entire room, the broadcast lenses and the condas, vast viewing public situated beyond them. I comprehend perfectly well why this specific legislative proposal bears my name. It is not titled as such, because my extensive career serves as the most egregious illustration of questionable financial practices within the legislature. There are prominently recognized individuals representing both sides of the political spectrum whose documented trading activities are vastly more aggressive than anything contained within my family's public filings. Rather, this bill is named after me because my identity is highly recognizable. It is named after me because attaching my name to a proposal instantly generates widespread media attention, because the proposing senator acutely understands that a piece of legislation carrying my specific moniker will inevitably receive a level of journalistic coverage that a bill named after a more obscure public figure would never garner. I possess a deep understanding of the political arena. I have actively participated in it for 38 years. I recognize exactly the nature of the strategic maneuvering currently unfolding within this room. She paused once more, this time not merely for rhetorical effect, but rather displaying the profound stillness of an individual articulating an undeniable reality. What I absolutely refuse to do, however, is to sit here and pretend that I am required to answer for actions I did not commit. I am present in this chamber today simply because my identity holds a specific political currency to certain individuals. and those individuals have made the calculated decision to expend that currency, the pursuit of a manufactured political performance, I harbor absolutely nothing to conceal. I have never possessed anything that required concealment, and my 38 years of extensively documented public service, transparent record of a leader who has arguably endured more intense, sustained scrutiny than nearly any other elected representative in the history of this republic, undoubtedly speaks for itself. With that final assertion, she elegantly resumed her seat. The allied senators positioned around the impressive wooden table collectively directed toward her, the distinct appreciative gaze, typical of an audience that has just witnessed a masterclass in rhetorical defense. Several of the lawmakers leaned back slightly in their leather chairs, visibly relaxed, while one strategically made a small, discreet notation on a pad that strongly suggested a highly favorable assessment of her performance. Across the dais, the presiding senator calmly set down his writing instrument. He lifted his gaze from the yellow legal pad for the very first time since she had commenced her impassioned defense. He looked intently at her, his facial expression mirroring that of a diligent student who had been meticulously recording notes and had successfully captured every single anticipated point. "Are you quite finished with your remarks, Congresswoman?" he inquired politely. "I am. Thank you," she replied, with measured grace. He smoothly reached for the first of the 4 carefully arranged folders, without even needing to glance at it. "I have a few specific inquiries." Exactly 6 weeks prior, during the momentous evening of the annual executive address, the senator had scrutinized the viral media clip no fewer than 3 times. He had completely bypassed the actual presidential speech. In favor of dissecting the subsequent interview, the broadcast, featuring the stateswoman, positioned in a brilliantly illuminated studio directly across from the inquisitive journalist. She had appeared remarkably composed and exceptionally confident, radiating the aura of a seasoned professional who had successfully navigated tens of thousands of similar media interactions, clearly treating this particular interview as an entirely routine engagement. And then came the pivotal moment. The journalist presenting the direct inquiry regarding the escalating controversy surrounding legislative financial investments. Noting the chief executive's unprecedented decision to single her out by name before the assembled Congress and directly asking what she wished to communicate in response, her surprisingly terse reply, "Look at your own self," had fascinated him. He had watched the exchange once, in its entirety, subsequently rewound the digital playback to observe it a second time, and finally watched it a third time, with the audio completely muted. During this final viewing, he focused exclusively on the nuanced micro-expressions playing across her face. The subtle, fleeting look of an individual who had definitively not prepared for a question of such piercing directness, visibly searching her mental archives for a rehearsed response that simply did not exist. At precisely 11 o'clock that evening, he had placed a call to his chief of staff. Observe the mechanism by which she has historically survived every other challenge he had instructed. She operates under the assumption that her traditional playbook remains highly effective. His chief of staff had immediately concurred, noting, "The strategy has always proven successful. Every single time the established playbook dictates that she must absorb the initial critique, seamlessly transform the attack into a financially and politically costly endeavor for the instigator, and simply wait for the remarkably short attention span of the modern news cycle to transition to a new topic. That methodology is exceptionally potent against traditional adversarial attacks." The senator had allowed a heavy silence to stretch across the cellular connection before revealing his strategy. "We are absolutely not going to initiate a traditional attack against her." The silence on the line deepened. "Then what exactly is our objective?" his staffer finally asked. "We are simply going to present her with questions. We will utilize her own spoken words, her own publicly filed documents, and her own authorized signature on the official disclosures." Consequently, he had directed his dedicated staff to focus exclusively on this singular task for the ensuing 6 weeks. They did not engage in conventional opposition research. They did not delve into shadowed corners attempting to unearth previously undiscovered scandals, nor did they waste valuable resources searching for information that had not already been extensively documented by the press. Every single piece of data they required had been readily available in the public domain for years. The comprehensive financial disclosures were meticulously archived. Her public statements were forever etched into the congressional and media records, and the chronological timeline of events was undeniably established through their meticulous efforts. They constructed 4 distinct folders. The primary folder contained the irrefutable mathematics. It chronicled 38 years of public service, an annual government compensation package of approximately $174,000, a staggering accumulated asset valuation of $267 million, and the profound, lingering question of how that monumental financial disparity was supposed to be interpreted by the diligent, hard-working families who had consistently cast their ballots in her favor since the late 1980s. The secondary folder was entirely dedicated to her own conflicting public statements. It highlighted the transcript from mid-December of the year prior, featuring her explicit rejection of an investment prohibition based on the principles of a free market economy. It then juxtaposed this with her unexpected reversal in early February, a shift seemingly catalyzed purely by external pressure, justified only by the vague assertion that the situation was complicated and that the legislature would figure it out. Finally, it included the transcript of the recent tense television interview containing her defensive 4-word deflection, 3 separate statements, delivered across 3 distinct points in time, addressing the exact same subject matter, yet offering 3 completely contradictory perspectives. The tertiary folder documented a highly specific chronological pattern. It detailed the strategic liquidation of significant financial sector equities in the summer, followed a mere 84 days later by the Justice Department initiating a landmark regulatory lawsuit against that very same Exxon's corporation. It noted the substantial divestment from a major technology conglomerate in the winter, trailed just 1 month later by another massive federal regulatory action targeting that specific entity's market dominance. It further highlighted the incredibly lucrative acquisition of advanced computing stock options in the autumn, generating an estimated $5 million in capital gains. The broader portfolio analytics contained within this folder painted a picture of investment, returns spanning a decade that astonishingly outperformed standard market indices by an astronomical 700%. Even focusing solely on the most recent fiscal year, the data revealed staggering portfolio gains ranging from 54 to 92%, achieved during a period when the general market experienced a comparatively modest 25% growth rate. The quaternary folder, however, was completely empty. It contained nothing but a single pristine sheet of blank white paper, a symbolic inclusion that the senator had personally placed inside. She is inevitably going to utilize her 38 years of dedicated service as an impenetrable shield. His communications director had accurately predicted the evening prior to the scheduled hearing. That is her consistent methodology. 1. Simply cannot launch a successful frontal assault against a portee the lifetime of public service. The senator had responded with chilling calm. I have no intention of attacking her service. I fully intend to utilize it. He had then picked up the fourth folder, gazing thoughtfully at the blank page resting within. She is going to stand proudly in the center of that chamber and passionately articulate to the entire world that her name fundamentally represents nearly 4 decades of unwavering service to this nation. And immediately following that declaration, I am going to politely ask her to explain why a piece of legislation bearing her exact name must exist if her identity truly represents such noble service. If a bipartisan majority of the American populace has critically examined her 38 years of service and collectively concluded that they desperately require a federal law named in her honor to actively prevent the very behaviors her career has come to symbolize, then her impassioned defense will have effectively finalized my entire pleasant argument for me. He had firmly closed the folder. There exists no conceivable answer to that specific question that does not extract a devastating political cost. If she forcefully asserts that the proposed law is unnecessary, she finds herself directly contradicting the strongly held beliefs of over 3/4 of the nation's citizens. Conversely, if she concedes that the legislation is indeed necessary, she is tacitly admitting that she embodies the very problem it seeks to address. And if she ultimately chooses not to provide an answer at all, which is precisely the outcome I am anticipating, then the 12 million citizens observing the broadcast from their homes will intimately understand exactly why he had gently returned the folder to the summit of the stack. Certain questions do not require the introduction of new evidence. They merely require being asked in the correct room at the precise moment in time, and then being permitted to echo in the resulting silence. Congresswoman the senator commenced opening the first folder without any theatrical flourish, seamlessly sliding a printed document onto the polished surface of the table. Before introducing a second document immediately adjacent to it, I would like to initiate our dialogue by focusing on something quite straightforward: simple mathematics. He carefully positioned a third document. When you originally took your oath of office in the winter of 1987, your mandatory possession, financial disclosures indicated that your family's portfolio was valued somewhere between $610,000 and $785,000. That information is a matter of established public record. At that juncture, you had been married for over 2 decades, and your spouse had been diligently establishing his professional enterprise throughout that time frame. I fully recognize that these assets represent the cumulative combined efforts of a family unit, and I am in no way disputing that foundational fact. He leveled his gaze at her. However, your most recent financial disclosure formally submitted during the spring of the previous year details accumulated assets that independent financial analysts consistently estimate to be valued at approximately $267 million. While I acknowledge that the broad reporting ranges required by current disclosure laws span from $100 million to well over $400 million, the widely accepted consensus figure within independent financial reporting remains steadfast at roughly $267 million. He gently rested his pen on the legal pad. The designated annual compensation for the serving member of this legislative body is $74,000 prior to the deduction of federal taxes. If an individual were to meticulously save every single penny of every single paycheck, assuming a hypothetical scenario with zero tax obligations, zero living expenses, zero housing costs, absolutely no expenditures whatsoever, it would require approximately 1,534 continuous years to legitimately accumulate a fortune $267 million, relying solely upon a congressional salary. If one were to factor in taxation at any reasonable standard rate, that timeline easily extends well beyond 3 millennia. He allowed the monumental weight of that mathematical reality to permeate the quiet chamber, employing the deliberate pacing necessary when one wishes for an audience to internally process the profound implications of the numbers presented. Now, I am certainly not implying that your government salary constitutes the entirety of your household's income. Your spouse's independent business revenue is a tangible reality, and it is a fundamental economic principle that investment returns compound significantly over extended periods. I comprehend those mechanics entirely. What I am attempting to explore, however, is a profoundly different concept. He leaned slightly forward, diminishing the physical space between them. You have had the privilege of representing your vibrant district for 38 years. Currently, the median household income within that specific geographic area hovers around $130,000. Concurrently, the median valuation for a residential property in that same district exceeds $1.3 million. In practical terms, this dictates that a typical family earning the median income, even while adhering to incredibly aggressive savings strategies, would require roughly a full decade of dedicating their entire gross income just to secure a standard down payment on an average home. A vast majority of the constituents residing in your district are dedicated working-class individuals. They are the culinary professionals, the healthcare support staff, the dedicated educators, parents who send their children to the local public school systems, and who quietly harbor deep-seated anxieties year after year regarding whether they are steadily falling behind in the relentless economic current. When those specific, hard-working families observe a financial portfolio that has miraculously expanded from under $1 million to over $250 million, precisely during the 38 years you were elected to represent their interests, what logical conclusion are they supposed to draw? The stateswoman's vocal response remained perfectly modulated. My husband has functioned as an exceptionally successful business professional since a time long preceding my initial foray into public life. His proven investment acumen serves as a direct reflection of decades of dedicated. Exactly how many families currently residing within your district possess a personal portfolio valued at $267 million? The interruption was notably devoid of anger. It was simply a surgical, precise interjection designed to actively eliminate the possibility of a tangential, evasive answer. That is simply not a relevant or appropriate metric for comparison, she countered. You have dedicated 38 years to assuring those exact families that you are tirelessly fighting on their behalf in this capital. That assertion serves as the fundamental premise of your entire public service record. Primary reason, you have successfully secured victory in election after election within that specific district, is that those voters genuinely believe you maintain a profound understanding of their daily struggles and that you are actively legislating in their best present sense interests. I am simply asking, how does it genuinely appear to a struggling family residing in the Richmond neighborhood, or the Mission or Chinatown families who are utterly exhausted from working multiple demanding jobs, families who find themselves increasingly unable to afford the cost of living in the very city of their birth. When you casually characterize your household's extraordinary, astronomical accumulation of wealth as merely the natural expected byproduct of participating in a privatization free market system that they themselves are structurally prohibited from accessing in any comparable manner. The profound silence that immediately blanketed the room was of a very specific variety. The heavy, suffocating stillness that inevitably materializes when an inquiry has been posed, that completely lacks a graceful, rhetorically safe exit strategy. The stateswoman's dedicated staff, positioned at the periphery of the room, remained absolutely motionless. "I have dedicated the entirety of my professional career," she articulated with extreme care, "to fiercely advocating for progressive policies specifically designed to dramatically expand the horizon of economic opportunity. Working-class families and your personal portfolio managed to swell to $267 million concurrently while you were engaged in that advocacy. That is my husband's private portfolio. You legally share those assets. The financial disclosures are filed jointly. I completely understand the legal distinction you are attempting to draw between your personal assets and his independent transactions. However, I am not currently inquiring about legal distinctions." The senator swiftly transitioned to the second, carefully prepared folder. Mid-December of the annotice. Year prior, he delicately extracted a printed transcript and smoothed it onto the tabletop. He had intentionally utilized a bright yellow highlighter to emphasize a single specific passage, ensuring place. The vibrant color was clearly visible to the array of broadcast cameras. A member of the press directly asked you whether you would support implementing a comprehensive ban, preventing members of the legislature from actively trading individual corporate stocks. Your response, and I am quoting your precise recorded words directly from the official transcript, was, "No, I do not. We maintain a responsibility to report on the stock. Because this is a free market. And people, we are a free market. Economy, they should absolutely be able to participate in that." He set the transcript aside. Exactly 8 weeks later, in early February, you publicly announced that you now fully supported such a trading prohibition. Your official statement to the assembled reporters was simply, "It is complicated, and the members will figure it out." He placed a second document on the table. You offered absolutely no substantive explanation for the dramatic reversal in your policy position. Nor did you provide any accounting for what specific factors had shifted during those intervening 8 weeks. You simply offered the phrase, "It's complicated. Members will figure it out." He locked his gaze upon her. Just last week, during a national television broadcast following the State of the Union, you were asked a very direct question regarding the chief executive. Choosing to name you during his address, specifically within the context of the ongoing controversy surrounding congressional stock trading. Your response, once again, utilizing your exact phrasing, was a dismissive, "Look at your own self." He aligned the third document perfectly beside the previous two. 3 distinct public statements issued across 3 different years, offering 3 entirely contradictory answers to the exact same fundamental question. He folded his hands, purposefully resting them on the table. You had the distinct privilege of serving as the Speaker of this legislative body for a combined total of 8 years. Throughout the duration of those 8 years, you personally wielded more direct concentrated power over the flow of AI, the national legislative agenda, than any other single individual within this government. The Speaker maintains absolute control over which proposals are permitted to reach the floor for debate. Absolutely nothing receives a formal vote without the Speaker's explicit affirmative decision to schedule it. During your lengthy tenure, wielding that gavel, comprehensive legislation designed to completely ban or severely restrict the ability of elected representatives to trade individual stocks was formally introduced during multiple legislative sessions. Furthermore, these proposals enjoyed robust bipartisan support. Esteemed colleagues spanning the ideological spectrum have vigorously championed these efforts. Polling data collected consistently throughout your time as Speaker consistently demonstrated that an overwhelming 68 to 80% of the American electorate, bridging all political affiliations, strongly supported the implementation of a trading ban. Yet during your 8 years serving as Speaker, possessing the unilateral authority to schedule a floor vote on literally any piece of legislation you desired, a proposal to ban congressional stock trading mysteriously never once made its way to the floor for consideration. He waited, allowing the weight of that historical fact to settle. I am simply trying to understand why. The stateswoman subtly adjusted her posture, straightening her back. The determination of legislative priorities is dictated by a highly complex. You somehow managed to find the necessary floor time to debate and pass the landmark healthcare reform. You successfully found the necessary floor time to advance the massive Semiconductor Manufacturing Act. You routinely found ample floor time for legislation that was infinitely more complex and vastly more politically controversial than a straightforward trading ban. Those represented entirely different circumstances. A proposed bill boasting 76% public approval, enjoying widespread bipartisan backing in both chambers of Congress, and facing absolutely no serious procedural hurdles. Yet, across 8 years, you consistently found yourself unable to locate the required floor time. He maintained a completely level tone, completely devoid of any sharp edge or smug satisfaction. What precisely was so fundamentally different about that specific piece of legislation? The allied senators seated alongside her at the table had completely ceased attempting to project an aura of sympathetic solidarity. Instead, they had almost uniformly directed their attention downward, intently scrutinizing their own notepads. The senator's inquiry was not aggressively demanding that she condemn herself. Rather, it was simply asking her to provide a logical explanation for a documented historical reality. Unfortunately for the stateswoman, every single explanation available to her was arguably more damaging than absolute silence. Recognizing that a substantive answer was not forthcoming, the senator smoothly transitioned to the third folder. I would now like to pivot our discussion to the concept of timing. He meticulously arranged 3 separate documents, simultaneously creating a precise visual row across his workspace. He had purposefully utilized a color-coded system for the chronological headers, employing striking red ink to denote the specific date of a financial transaction, and vibrant blue ink to highlight the date of the subsequent highly consequential government regulatory action early summer of the previous year. Your spouse effectively liquidates 2,000 shares of a major credit processor. The estimated value of this specific transaction falls somewhere between $500,000 and $1 million. At the precise moment this sale was executed, there existed absolutely no public indication whatsoever that the Federal Justice Department was in the process of preparing any form of public regulatory action related to this specific entity. He pointed directly to the blue header on the first document. 84 days subsequent to that sale, the Justice Department officially files a massive landmark antitrust lawsuit against that very corporation, formally alleging illegal monopolization tactics within the digital payment sector. The comprehensive suit asserted that the company had systematically utilized its dominant market power to illegally suppress market competition. Predictably, the corporation's stock valuation plummeted immediately following the public announcement of the lawsuit. He smoothly shifted his focus to the second piece of evidence. Winter of the year prior. Your spouse successfully offloads 30,000 shares of a major technology conglomerate's parent company. The financial value of this particular transaction is noted as highly substantial. He tapped the corresponding blue header. Exactly 1 month following that massive liquidation, the Justice Department initiates yet another major sweeping antitrust lawsuit against that specific technology giant, explicitly alleging illegal monopolization practices within the digital advertising ecosystem. A margin of merely 1 month, he finally directed his attention to the third document, late autumn. Your spouse executes the purchase of highly TIN's lucrative call options in a leading advanced computing firm, securing a strike price of $120. This specific market position ultimately generates an astonishing estimated gain of approximately $5 million as the company's stock valuation predictably skyrockets over the subsequent months, a surge driven in large part by the massive explosion in global demand for artificial intelligence infrastructure. He gently set the folder down. Independent financial researchers who have meticulously analyzed your family's publicly disclosed trading activities over the course of the past decade have concluded that an investment strategy strictly mirroring those exact trades would have yielded a return exceeding 700% since the year 2014. To provide essential context, the broader market index generated a return of approximately 230% over that exact same time frame. Looking strictly at the most recent calendar year alone, your family's officially disclosed portfolio managed to secure an estimated return ranging from 54 to 92%. This astonishing growth occurred during a year when the broader market managed a respectable 25% return, and notably during a period when virtually every major professionally managed investment fund operating on Wall Street significantly underperformed those specific benchmarks. He locked eyes with her, projecting absolute clarity. I want to be exceedingly precise regarding what I am currently asserting, and equally precise regarding what I am intentionally not asserting. I am absolutely not suggesting that securing such astronomical returns is a mathematical impossibility. Without the benefit of strictly confidential inside information, truly exceptional, visionary investors do exist in the world. Impeccable market timing can occasionally be attributed to raw skill and intuition rather than illicit foreknowledge. Furthermore, I am not positioned in this chamber to render any form of official legal determination, nor am I attempting to do so. He leaned in closer. What I am fundamentally stating is this: you have continuously occupied highly influential seats for years on powerful legislative committees, possessing direct, robust, oversight authority, governing the financial sector, the technology industry, and the intricate regulatory environment within which these massive corporations fiercely compete. The sweeping credit processor antitrust action, the aggressive technology conglomerate antitrust lawsuit, the massive influx of federal funding propelling the semiconductor investment boom that directly catalyzed the advanced computing firm's meteoric rise. These all represent specific sectors in which the federal government initiated highly consequential market-altering actions during the relevant timeframes. Crucially, these are also the exact sectors in which your family consistently held or actively traded massively lucrative financial positions. Your official office's standard response to every single journalistic or ethical inquiry regarding this undeniable pattern has remained completely identical, practically word for years. The speaker does not personally own any individual stocks and possesses absolutely no prior knowledge of any financial transactions executed by her spouse. I wish to respectfully inquire about those specific words. He continued specifically the phrase, no prior knowledge, not utilizing it as a strict legal standard, but rather as a practical, realistic description of human reality. He placed both of his hands flat against the cool surface of the table. You are undeniably not a peripheral or minor figure within the architecture of this government. You have definitively been one of the 5 or 6 most deeply informed individuals residing in this capital. For the better part of 2 decades, you routinely attend highly classified intelligence briefings regarding global national security, intricate macroeconomic conditions, and the anticipated regulatory posture of various federal agencies. You consistently receive highly sensitive intelligence assessments that the general public will never see, and that the vast majority of your own legislative colleagues are not authorized to access your prolonged tenure. As Speaker granted you an unparalleled panoramic view of the internal institutional machinery of this government, a vantage point that is available to essentially zero private citizens. Is it at all conceivable? And I stress that I am not inquiring about legal intent, nor am I asking about the strict standards of criminal liability. But is it simply within the realm of human possibility that over the course of a deeply intertwined life, lived together alongside your husband for 6 continuous decades, that some fragment of what you inherently know, what you deeply understand regarding the future trajectory of this government and the specific regulatory actions that are looming on the horizon, somehow found subtle expression in the complex financial 2P decisions being formulated under your shared roof? I am not suggesting the existence of an illicit memo. I am not alleging a secret clandestine meeting. I am speaking purely about the ambient, unspoken knowledge that inevitably accumulates and naturally flows between 2 individuals who intimately share every aspect of a life together. The stateswoman's facial expression remained rigidly controlled, yet a subtle, almost imperceptible tightening became apparent around her jawline. I have never. She articulated, her voice carrying the immense practiced weight of a declarative statement she had deployed countless times throughout. Her career utilized my esteemed position of public trust to secure any form of personal financial enrichment. I have never improperly transmitted any confidential information to my spouse regarding any pending matter before my assigned committees, nor any sensitive matter pertaining to official government business. Every single financial government bud disclosure mandated by the laws of this nation has been dutifully submitted on time and entirely in full. The mere suggestion that I simply asked a straightforward yes or no question. The senator interjected quietly, yet firmly. Is it possible? I have already provided my answer. You provided the carefully rehearsed, legally insulated version of the answer. I am asking the practical human version. A tense pause hung in the air. No, she finally stated. It is absolutely not possible. You remain entirely certain of that. I am entirely certain. The senator offered a singular nod, as if systematically filing her definitive response away for future reference. He then methodically shifted all 4 of the meticulously prepared folders to the far edge of the table. He did not perform this action carelessly. Rather, it was a highly deliberate movement. Clearly signaling the clearing of physical and psychological space, in preparation for an entirely different phase of the proceedings. The stark blank page that had previously resided within the fourth folder now rested prominently atop the reorganized stack. I possess only one final question. The atmosphere within the massive chamber immediately transformed the moment the folders were removed from the center of the table. Up until that precise moment, those folders had functioned as vital props in a highly specific manner, not merely as empty theatrical dressing, but as critical, structural elements representing the visible, tangible architecture of a rigorously documented evidentiary case. With those documents pushed to the periphery, a palpable shift occurred within the room. Proceedings abruptly transitioned away from being a dry, methodical review of chronological evidence and rapidly evolved into something entirely different, something infinitely more direct and deeply personal. The senator locked his gaze onto the stateswoman, completely devoid of the protective barrier previously provided by the legal pad, the writing instrument, or the stack of evidentiary papers. Last week, during the aftermath of the State of the Union address, you were explicitly asked, during a national television broadcast, what specific message you wished the nation to comprehend regarding the ongoing controversy surrounding congressional financial investments. Your initial response consisted of a mere 4 words: look at your own self. Subsequently, when the journalist prudently pressed the issue requesting that you elaborate and provide the viewing public with a more substantive, thoughtful explanation, you stated, if an adudivai individual genuinely commits a wrongful act, they face prosecution for it. The meaning embedded within that statement, it serves as an accurate factual observation regarding the mechanics of the judicial system. It remains undeniably true that measured strictly against the standards of the criminal justice system you have faced, no formal prosecution, no official legal charges have been levied against you. The established legal apparatus of this nation has not issued any formal conclusion indicating that you engaged in illicit behavior. However, my intention today is to ask you a question that completely transcends the narrow confines of legal culpability. He paused, allowing the gravity of the moment to build for just a fraction of a second. Congresswoman there currently sits before this esteemed legislative body, a specific piece of proposed legislation. It is a profoundly bipartisan endeavor. It presently enjoys the overwhelming verified support of a robust majority of the American populace, a consensus that completely bridges traditional partisan divides. The explicitly stated objective of this bill is to fundamentally address what its millions of supporters genuinely perceive to be a deeply embedded structural conflict of interest, actively degrading the operational integrity of this Congress, specifically the legally permissible ability of elected representatives to actively trade individual corporate equities belonging to the very same companies that their assigned committees are actively regulating, vigorously investigating, and continuously crafting binding policy around. That specific piece of legislation is officially named after you. He allowed that profound reality to resonate within the quiet chamber. It is importantly not named after an individual who has been formally convicted of a crime. It is not named in recognition of a highly publicized scandal, resulting in a formal judicial finding of guilt. It is not named in the aftermath of a dramatic criminal proceeding. Your exact name, the very same name that you just passionately testified, represents 38 years of dedicated, unwavering service to this nation, was specifically chosen by the drafting authors of this reform legislation, and it was subsequently implicitly accepted by the tens of millions of everyday Americans who have passionately rallied to support its passage. It was selected because it serves as the absolute clearest, most instantly recognizable shorthand for the exact systemic problem they are desperately attempting to eradicate. That is unequivocally what your name currently signifies to them, to roughly 3/4 of the entire American voting public. Whenever they contemplate the corrosive problem of congressional financial trading, your name is the very first image that materializes in their minds. He maintained his steady, unyielding gaze. During your opening remarks, you forcefully asserted that your name fundamentally represents 38 years of dedicated public service. I am not here to doubt the reality of those 38 years. I am certainly not attempting to dismiss the significance of the critical legislation you have successfully championed. Nor do I seek to minimize the immense difficulty of the political battles you described navigating. However, I must implore you to deeply consider a specific reality. When the proposing senator initially introduced this bill, he absolutely did not select your name at random. He purposefully chose it because it possessed profound resonance. He chose it because extensive internal polling data definitively proved that it resonated deeply. He chose it because when his team rigorously tested various messaging language with diverse voter groups spanning the entire political spectrum, your specific name was universally identified as the singular label that most accurately captured the precise nature of their anxieties. Furthermore, this is definitively not a phenomenon restricted to the opposing political party. Voters registered within your own political coalition consistently associate your name directly with this specific ethical issue in widespread surveys. Working-class members of your party, the younger generation of your party. These are precisely the exact demographics you have spent the last 38 years passionately claiming to tirelessly fight for. He leaned slightly closer, ensuring his voice carried the necessary weight without requiring volume. Therefore, I wish to ask you not about the specifics of any individual financial trade, not about the intricate nuances of the legal standard of proof, and certainly not about your husband, but rather, I wish to pose the most fundamentally simple question I am capable of articulating. He paused briefly. If there is truly nothing ethically compromised about this situation, if every single transaction was executed in strict adherence to the law, if every required disclosure was filed with absolute completeness, if every single decision was executed entirely above reproach, then why does a sweeping federal law, bearing your exact name, need to exist in the first place? Why did a massive, bipartisan majority of the American citizenry carefully examine your extensive career, a career you just described, as consisting of 38 years dedicated to fighting for working families, collectively conclude that you represent the absolute clearest, most undeniable example of the very systemic problem this specific law was explicitly designed to prevent? If your name genuinely stands as a monument to public service, why does it simultaneously stand as the ultimate symbol of the problem? He abruptly stopped speaking. He made no further additions to his inquiry. He did not physically retreat by leaning back in his chair, nor did he break his intense eye contact. The stateswoman inhaled deeply. Throughout her expansive 38-year career, she had faced down incredibly hostile rooms. She had confronted aggressive individuals who had shouted at her adversaries, who had attempted to ensnare her in complex procedural traps, political operatives who had maliciously leaked sensitive documents to the media in attempts to sabotage her, and ambitious colleagues who had actively organized internal coalition votes designed to strip her of the hard-earned, leadership positions she had legitimately secured. She had successfully confronted practically every single species of political opposition that the ruthless environment of the Capitol could possibly manufacture. And she had emerged, victorious from all of them. Yet crucially, those prior instances had all been recognizable structural attacks. A seasoned politician can survive a direct attack by tactically absorbing the momentum, cleverly reframing the narrative, and ensuring the retaliation is politically expensive for the aggressor. One can survive a direct accusation by issuing a forceful, unequivocal denial. One can survive the release of a damaging document by swiftly providing mitigating context. This current situation, however, was fundamentally different. This was not a recognizable attack. It was simply a profoundly devastating question. And the insidious nature of this specific question was that it demanded she provide a logical explanation for a phenomenon that fundamentally defied explanation. At least any explanation that would be considered politically acceptable within the confines of that chamber. The raw, honest truth, the only conceivable answer that possessed the ring of absolute authenticity, was simply that the American public had critically evaluated her long career and recognized a behavioral pattern they desperately wanted to legally prohibit. And vocalizing that stark reality aloud, officially entering it into the permanent congressional record broadcasting, it live in front of the assembled cameras. And the 12 million citizens actively watching the proceedings was the absolute one action. She was fundamentally incapable of performing, because admitting that truth would instantly validate every single devastating implication embedded within the senator's inquiry. Consequently, a viable answer simply did not exist. My name has been purposefully leveraged, she cautiously began, for purely theatrical political purposes by individuals who, why does the law need to exist? The interruption was remarkably gentle, possessing the tone of someone politely guiding a wandering conversation back to its central premise. This legislation is actively being deployed as a blunt political instrument designed to intentionally mislead. Not the specific name attached to the bill, but rather the core substance of it. The proposed prohibition on congressional stock trading. If the current regulatory framework, the existing disclosure acts, and the established ethical guidelines is truly sufficient to prevent massive conflicts of interest, why do 76% of the American people, after closely observing this institution, operate under those exact rules for decades? Firmly believe that we desperately require a significantly more restrictive framework. Furthermore, public trust in our vital institutions is negatively impacted by a multitude of factors. So, why specifically does a comprehensive federal law bearing your exact name need to exist? The third time he presented the question, he delivered it with a quiet intensity, and immediately afterward, he ceased speaking entirely. He simply waited. He had explicitly instructed his dedicated staff beforehand that he was fully prepared to wait for as long as the situation required. He had, firmly stated, allow the overwhelming weight of the silence to perform the necessary labor. Do not attempt to fill the void. Do not offer helpful prompts. Do not aggressively push for a response. Simply ask the fundamental question and then embrace the waiting. 38 years of public service. 8 highly influential years wielding the speaker's gavel. Countless chaotic press conferences. Hundreds of intense committee hearings. Thousands of high-stakes television appearances, and an endless barrage of deeply hostile inquiries launched by every conceivable journalist and political adversary she had encountered since 1987, 4 agonizing seconds of absolute silence. To every single individual present within the massive chamber, the duration felt infinitely longer. It manifested as the specific heavy variety of silence that possesses a tangible, almost physical shape. A silence you can vividly feel actively pressing against the grand walls of the room. A silence you can almost audibly hear as the broadcast cameras relentlessly continue to record the moment of silence. You can viscerally sense the 12 million remote viewers experiencing, simultaneously, within the intimate confines of their living rooms, their kitchens, and on their mobile devices during their daily commutes. The silence itself was not inherently dramatic in a theatrical sense. Rather, it was simply the profound, devastating absence of an answer that was remotely adequate for the severity of the moment. And then, as abruptly as it began, the moment concluded, it did not end. Because the stateswoman miraculously discovered the perfect rhetorical escape route, but rather because 4 seconds is fundamentally the absolute maximum duration that absolute silence can realistically be sustained within a highly charged public room. Before that very silence has already communicated everything that needs to be said. I possess no further questions for this specific witness, the senator announced quietly. The formal legislative hearing ground on for an additional 26 minutes. Other senators engaged in their allotted questioning periods. The stateswoman addressed their inquiries with the precise efficiency and practiced composure, characteristic of an individual who had successfully answered tens of thousands of similar questions under the glare of bright lights, and understood exactly how the performative mechanism operated. She was rhetorically precise. She was emotionally controlled. She flawlessly delivered her prepared talking points. She vigorously defended the totality of her historic record. However, absolutely none of those subsequent actions mattered in the slightest, because 12 million citizens had already witnessed those agonizing 4 seconds of devastating silence, and every single word spoken thereafter was perceived as nothing more than hollow commentary. Upon the conclusion of the proceedings, the stateswoman methodically gathered her various materials. Her facial expression remained a mask of practiced composure. Her dedicated staff immediately surrounded her, assuming the protective, seamless formation they had flawlessly executed for years. She confidently exited the chamber, utilizing the exact same dignified posture she had employed upon entering. Out in the marble hallway, her frantic communications director was already engaged in an urgent phone call with the dedicated fundraising team. The necessary email appeal was already drafted and awaiting deployment. They had navigated similar crises countless times before. They inherently understood the established sequence of events that invariably followed. She had, historically, survived every challenge. She fundamentally always survived. However, on this particular occasion, a subtle but profound shift had occurred, and the resulting difference was definitively not a hurdle. She could simply fundraise her way over. By 9 o'clock that same evening, the specific media clip was massively trending across digital platforms in 46 separate states. The viral content was not the entirety of the lengthy hearing, nor was it the complex financial disclosure documents, the astonishing portfolio, valuation numbers, or the intricate chronological timeline of the controversial trades. It was solely the isolated 11 seconds containing the final devastating question and the subsequent agonizing silence. Individuals were rapidly sharing the footage across their networks, but notably, they were not doing so fueled by explosive outrage. Rather, they were sharing it with something infinitely quieter and more profound. The very particular grim satisfaction derived from observing an impossible question finally land squarely upon an individual who possessed absolutely no viable answer for it. At exactly 47 minutes past 11 o'clock that evening, her official political office blasted out the urgent fundraising email. The subject line read, "They leveraged my identity for political theater. Stand with me." By the break of dawn, the aggressive appeal had successfully raised $3.6 million directly from her most dedicated donor base. The deeply committed, the fiercely loyal, the individuals who had been consistently contributing financially for decades. Concurrently, the viral media clip had amassed a staggering 89 million verified views. Her embattled communications team desperately pointed to the rapid influx of $3.6 million as definitive proof that they had successfully triumphed over the immediate news cycle. What they actively chose not to point toward, what they were fundamentally incapable of acknowledging, was the devastating reality that 89 million individual citizens had just watched the stateswoman who proudly claimed to be the ultimate champion of struggling working families sit in absolute paralyzed silence when politely asked to explain exactly why her own name had become universally synonymous with the exact ethical problem the nation was desperately attempting to solve. The $3.6 million originated from individuals whose minds had been irrevocably made up decades prior. The 89 million viewers were actively in the process of making up their minds right at that very moment. The first truly significant indicator that the foundational ground was shifting emerged from deep within the ranks of her own political coalition. Exactly 3 days following the disastrous hearing, a newly elected freshman, representative belonging to her own party, hailing from a highly contested swing district in Pennsylvania, participated in an interview with her local publication. When directly asked whether she supported the passage of the legislation bearing the stateswoman's name, her response was telling. "I genuinely believe that what the proposing senator is attempting to address is a very real systemic problem." The committee hearing held earlier this week made that reality abundantly clear. It was a remarkably cautious response, a carefully hedged statement, precisely the variety of answer a seasoned politician typically deploys when they are desperately attempting to avoid generating controversial headlines, yet it generated massive headlines regardless, specifically because she belonged to the stateswoman's own party, because she had narrowly secured her fragile congressional seat in the previous election cycle by a margin of merely 6 points in a volatile district, where a 6-point victory felt akin to a massive mandate, because her vital financial donors were paying close attention, because her crucial voters were closely monitoring the situation, and because she had astutely calculated that the underlying political mathematics of the situation had fundamentally shifted. By the conclusion of that highly turbulent week, 11 separate elected representatives belonging to her own political party had released formal public statements explicitly supporting some variation of comprehensive reform regarding congressional financial trading. 6 of those statements directly referenced the specific committee hearing. 2 of them explicitly referenced the devastating moment of silence. The stateswoman's loyal inner circle desperately attempted to dismiss the escalating situation as a mere temporary anomaly. A brief blip on the radar, they had navigated countless similar anomalies throughout her lengthy career. What? They had absolutely never encountered before, however, was the sight of their own loyal members actively performing the harsh political arithmetic and arriving at a detrimental conclusion. Her era of absolute dominance is concluded, a senior strategist within her own party bluntly stated, not during an interview with a journalist, but rather during a supposedly private conversation with a trusted colleague, an exchange that was subsequently leaked to a reporter who agreed to conceal the source's identity. "I do not mean she is entirely finished in politics. She will undoubtedly retain her congressional seat. She will continue to wield a degree of significant influence, but the extended phase of her career wherein she could simply stroll into any room in this capital and instantly be recognized as the most powerful individual present. By default, that specific phase is permanently over. When asked what specifically had catalyzed this dramatic shift, the strategist was precise. She fundamentally failed to answer the question. It was merely a single inquiry. She has successfully navigated and answered tens of thousands of times complex questions throughout her career. This was just one, the specific question regarding her own legacy. And she sat there paralyzed for 4 agonizing seconds, while 12 million citizens watched the broadcast, and she simply could not manufacture an answer that possessed any credibility. For 38 years, her standard impenetrable defense was always, "I have served this nation." And that defense remained highly effective because it contained a fundamental truth, because the attacks historically levied against her were universally partisan in nature. They invariably originated from the opposing side of the ideological spectrum. They were launched by individuals who fundamentally despised her for deeply entrenched ideological reasons. Consequently, the shield of public service remained highly robust. You could easily pivot and assert, "These individuals are attacking me because of the progressive policies I champion, not because of any ethical failure on my part." However, the senator in that hearing did not attack her based on her political ideology. He merely asked her to logically explain the vast fortune she had accumulated. And crucially, that specific question does not possess a partisan origin. That inquiry originates from the exact same place as the 76% bipartisan polling data. It originates directly from the very people who have consistently voted for her. The strategist paused, emphasizing the gravity of the situation. When your own dedicated voters begin performing that specific arithmetic, and they find themselves deeply unsettled by the resulting answer, the traditional shield of public service instantly loses its efficacy. And the truly remarkable aspect of this specific moment, the exact element that entirely differentiates it from every other crisis she has faced in her career, is that the senator never provided her with a recognizable enemy to fight. Every single previous attack against her was launched by a named, easily identifiable opponent, a member of the opposition party, a staunch conservative, a vocal critic, whose underlying motivations her communications team could effortlessly explain away and subsequently discount. This time, the devastating question simply hung there in the air. There was no identifiable adversary to attack, no specific ideology to rally against. There was only a simple question regarding the ultimate meaning of her name and the deafening silence that occupied the space where a credible answer should have resided. One simply cannot launch a successful fundraising campaign based on a question they failed to answer. One cannot create a viral media clip highlighting the fact that an opponent intentionally chose not to attack them. That agonizing silence fundamentally lacks a recognizable face that can be plastered onto an outrage-inducing mailer merely 4 days following the dramatic hearing. The primary newspaper, serving the stateswoman's home district, published a highly consequential story. The stark headline read, "Following the recent Senate hearing, the stateswoman's enduring legacy faces unprecedented scrutiny from within her own loyal base." Crucially, this piece of journalism did not originate from a hostile conservative media outlet. It was not manufactured by an operative from the opposing party or a right-wing digital platform. It originated directly from the very publication that had meticulously covered her district for decades. The exact same newspaper whose esteemed editorial board had reliably endorsed her candidacy during every single election she had ever participated in. When a publication possessing that specific pedigree decides to run a headline of that nature. The political base absolutely takes notice. The deeply impactful article prominently featured direct quotes from 6 different residents of her home district, individuals who had consistently cast their ballots in her favor anywhere from 3 to 9 separate times. Absolutely none of the individuals interviewed identified as Republicans. None of them identified as conservatives. They were quite literally the exact individuals she was elected to represent, the very people she had passionately referenced during her opening testimony as the hard-working families she had spent almost 4 decades fighting for. A 41-year-old culinary professional named Diego, who had loyally voted for her on 5 separate occasions, articulated his shifting perspective. "I currently earn approximately $52,000 annually. I have been earning that exact same amount for a considerable period of time." She continuously claims that she is tirelessly fighting for individuals in my exact position. Now, I am certainly not alleging that she is fined as criminal or that she broke the law. What I am stating is that I watched the broadcast of her completely failing to answer the very straightforward question regarding the accumulation of $267 million. And I internally concluded, okay, now I fully understand the reality of the situation. A 68-year-old retired healthcare worker named Patricia, who had cast her vote for the stateswoman an impressive 7 times, offered a similarly disappointed view. "I absolutely do not harbor any hatred toward her. I do not believe she is inherently malicious. I simply believe she is a career politician who made absolutely certain to prioritize the financial well-being of her own family while simultaneously fulfilling her public duties to us. I just sincerely wish she had possessed the port integrity to be completely honest about that reality, rather than continuously pretending that public service and massive private wealth accumulation were mutually exclusive concepts." A 29-year-old dedicated educator named Marcus, who had voted for her for the first time during the previous election cycle, expressed deep disillusionment. "My students frequently ask me why they should bother caring about the political process. I honestly never know exactly how to respond to them. I watched that specific congressional hearing, and I immediately thought, what am I supposed to tell them now? Am I supposed to explain that the very individual elected to represent our community was completely incapable of explaining why a major federal law needed to be named after her? To prevent ethical conflicts, am I supposed to tell them that she just sat there in absolute silence?" The publication purposefully paired the devastating article with a stark photograph of the stateswoman captured during the exact moment of the infamous silence. In the image, her eyes were cast downward, her hands rested flatly upon the antecedent table before her, and she fundamentally appeared as an individual who was simply waiting, hoping against hope, for a highly uncomfortable moment to finally pass. Exactly 15 days following the hearing, the internal, highly confidential polling apparatus of the stateswoman's own political party officially released a comprehensive memorandum, quietly distributed exclusively among the senior leadership echelons. The meticulously gathered data revealed the following grim reality within her solidly blue home state. Her overall favorability rating among registered voters of her own party had plummeted by an astonishing 17 points in merely 2 weeks. Her favorability rating among crucial independent voters had cratered by a massive 29 points. Most devastatingly, her standing among younger voters within her own party, those under the age of 40, had collapsed by 22, an unprecedented 31 points. The confidential memorandum contained a highly specific analytical conclusion, a sentence that was heavily underlined in several of the physical copies actively circulating among the anxious leadership. The rapid and severe decline in overall favorability is notably concentrated not among the segment of voters who firmly believe she committed a specific prosecutable legal offense, but rather among the vast swath of voters who now explicitly describe themselves as no longer entirely certain that she did not. This represented a fundamentally different, far more insidious political crisis than a straightforward criminal allegation. A specific criminal charge can be forcefully rebutted with a rigorous legal defense, a presentation of exculpatory evidence, and a definitive courtroom victory. However, the rapidly metastasizing perception of an ethical void cannot be cured in a court of law. The established party apparatus reacted with their standard, deeply ingrained response to practically any crisis. They frantically scheduled an influx of high-dollar fundraising events. They aggressively amplified their supportive messaging aimed at the core base. And they anxiously waited for the notoriously fickle news cycle to inevitably transition to a fresh controversy. The fatal flaw in their strategy, however, was that the news cycle had in fact already moved on. The profound problem was that it had permanently moved to the established historical record, the viral media clip, the agonizing silence, those specific 4 seconds of devastating reality. They all now resided permanently on every mobile device across every digital platform, seamlessly integrated into every single casual conversation regarding what had truly transpired within that chamber. On that fateful Tuesday morning, news cycles are inherently temporary phenomena. Historical records are terrifyingly permanent. The comprehensive reform legislation eventually passed the Senate chamber, a mere 7 weeks following the dramatic hearing. The final recorded tally was an overwhelming 67 affirmative votes to 33 negative votes, a significant block of 15 senators from the opposing. The party joined the effort, and notably all but 2 senators from the stateswoman's own party voted in favor of the measure. It was definitively not a tightly contested vote. It was not an exercise in partisan brinkmanship. It was precisely the variety of legislative outcome that inevitably materializes when a specific issue has become absolutely politically toxic to oppose when the sheer volume of public pressure has steadily accumulated, far past the critical threshold, where continuing to mount an obstructionist defense remains a viable survival strategy for any elected official who harbors ambitions of winning a future general election. The stateswoman's official office released a carefully worded, highly sanitized public statement expressing broad, generalized support for the conceptual framework of ethical reform. Crucially, the statement completely avoided specifically endorsing the actual piece of legislation that bore her exact name. Furthermore, she notably declined to deliver any remarks on the House floor regarding the matter. Consequently, her name was formally and permanently inscribed into the official United States Code, not as a distinguished honor, not as a revered memorial celebrating a lifetime of service, but purely as a functional label. It became the permanent legal shorthand for a systemic problem, chosen strictly because empirical testing had definitively proven that her specific identity communicated the true nature of that problem far more clearly, immediately, and effectively than any sterile, neutral description ever could. The legislation was officially signed into law. The controversial trading practices were formally prohibited. The historical record was essentially complete, and on the exact day, the new regulations officially took effect. 3. Completely separate elected representatives belonging to her own political party proudly delivered impassioned speeches on the House floor, enthusiastically praising the monumental achievement of the reform effort, and absolutely none of them mentioned her name. This glaring omission did not occur because they had been formally instructed by leadership to avoid mentioning her. Nobody had issued any such directive. They avoided her name simply because publicly invoking it had suddenly become entirely too complicated, publicly aligning themselves alongside. Her specific legacy, in front of the broadcast cameras, now required a highly nuanced defensive explanation that they simply had absolutely no desire to provide to their constituents. Her fiercely loyal staff members undoubtedly noticed the shift. They had spent the better part of 38 years meticulously tracking exactly who invoked her name, with reverence, and who pointedly avoided it, maintaining detailed mental ledgers regarding who happily included her in their public remarks, and who intentionally found convenient reasons to speak around her. They inherently understood the profound implications when her own allied members suddenly began utilizing linguistic gymnastics to avoid acknowledging her presence. That was the precise moment. The internal calculation officially changed deep within the ranks of her own caucus. It did not happen accompanied by dramatic fanfare, nor did it occur all at once in the manner these massive shifts are often portrayed. It happened incredibly quietly, manifesting as one solitary pragmatic calculation at a time. One individual member privately deciding that the underlying political mathematics of the situation had finally shifted significantly enough to require a vastly different alignment for their own self-preservation. That quiet abandonment when her own loyal people simply ceased saying her name aloud in public represented the true, agonizing conclusion of her era. A hard-working citizen named Robert Chen had loyally cast his ballot for the stateswoman, an impressive 9 consecutive times. He had originally immigrated to the city from Hong Kong in the late 1980s, and had subsequently built a modest, deeply respected culinary establishment in the Richmond district, fueled by 3 decades of the exact variety of relentless, exhausting labor that rarely demands public recognition. He had consistently voted for her, simply because she had always fundamentally seemed, in his estimation, like an individual who genuinely understood the intrinsic necessary relationship between grueling work and eventual reward. Someone who inherently knew that what a person builds with their own hands ultimately defines who they are. He eventually watched the viral media clip on his adult son's mobile device long after the chaotic dinner service had concluded. Sitting in the peaceful quiet of his restaurant, long after the final patron had departed into the night, he intently watched the senator deliver the devastating question. He watched the subsequent 4 seconds of agonizing silence unfold. She simply didn't answer the question, he observed quietly. No, she didn't, his son agreed. Why exactly do you suppose she didn't provide an answer? His son Kevin considered the question for a moment. Perhaps there simply isn't a good answer to give. Robert Chen gently placed the mobile device back onto the table. He thoughtfully surveyed the interior of his establishment. The slightly worn tables he had proudly purchased second-hand over 2 decades prior. The walls that his son, had diligently helped him repaint during the previous spring season. The cramped kitchen, where he had personally spent the mornings of the last 30 years. If there truly is no good answer, he finally stated with a profound sense of quiet realization, then I suppose that in itself is the answer. He reached for his jacket. He was scheduled to return to the kitchen by 6 o'clock the following morning. 3 full years later, when a prominent documentary filmmaker eventually traveled to the city to interview him for a retrospective project, he offered a remarkably clear perspective. I absolutely do not harbor any hatred toward her. I never hated her at any point, but I loyally voted for her 9 separate times because I genuinely believed she fundamentally understood what it actually meant to truly earn something. The core concept that the financial resources you possess should accurately reflect the sheer amount of labor you actually performed. After watching that specific hearing, I clearly understood that she fully knew that difficult question was eventually coming, and she simply possessed no answer for it. Not an answer suitable for a room like that, and certainly not an answer suitable for the 12 million citizens actively watching. He briefly directed his gaze toward the swinging doors of his kitchen. I have been successfully operating this small restaurant for 30 years. During a highly successful year, I might personally earn approximately $80,000. If I were to aggressively liquidate every single asset I own today, my entire life's work might be valued at roughly $2 million. During her time, supposedly dedicated purely to public service, she managed to accumulate $267 million. I am absolutely not alleging that she stole those funds. What I am stating is that she was completely incapable of explaining how she acquired them. And if an individual is fundamentally unable to logically explain the vast resources they possess, if the absolute only available answer is total silence, then I intimately know exactly what that specific variety of silence means. I have witnessed it before. I know exactly what it signifies. He slowly stood up, preparing to return to his grueling daily labor. That sweeping federal law currently bears her name, he noted softly. That is her ultimate legacy now. It is not the landmark healthcare reform. It is not the historic impeachments. Her true legacy is the specific law that absolutely had to be named after her, because her actions were the primary reason it became completely necessary. He quietly walked back toward the kitchen to resume his work. The documentary camera lingered continuously on the empty chair he had just vacated. The heavy weight of the devastating question remained suspended in the air exactly where he had been sitting, and her name remained permanently etched into the law.